Good evening, everybody, and welcome. We're so glad that so many of you can be with us this evening to talk about this very important topic. This is such an important topic that this program is being co-sponsored by Indivisible St. Louis, the Jewish Community Relations Council, the League of Women Voters, the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition, and the National Council of Jewish Women, in addition to Women's Voices Raised for Social Justice. So we thank our partners for their co-sponsorship, and we thank you for your participation. Before we get started with the actual program, I just want to highlight a couple of our events that are coming up. On December 7th, we're having a lunch and learn at noon, and it will feature unpacking the recent affordable housing report card, which was not a happy grade. But please join the author, the primary author of that report card, and she will unpack that for us. And then on December 9th, we have our regular educational program on Thursday evenings, and that's going to focus on guns, trauma, and suicide prevention. Another topic that is very much, I think, on the radar screen of so many of us. So I'd like to pass the baton to Michelle Steinberg, who is a member of our advocacy committee and chair of our membership committee, and is our point person on voting record and voting rights issues. So Michelle.
Thank you all for joining us. As she said, I'm Michelle Steinberg, and I'm part of the advocacy committee as well as serve as membership chair. So keeping that in mind, if you enjoy our program this evening, I hope you will consider becoming a member. Membership starts at just $45, and by joining, you will add your voice to our collective efforts and allow us to continue our advocacy and education efforts. Before I introduce our speakers, I want to let you know about our Be Thankful holiday cards and door hanger project. To respond to the growing dangers of deceptive information, Women's Voices has created greeting cards and door hangers pre-printed with the 7 steps to protect yourself from disinformation. Here's a little sample. Misinformation and disinformation surrounding elections is especially concerning as it serves as a pretext for passing suppressive voting laws. This leads voters to make decisions they otherwise would not make. We invite you to join us in placing these door hangers throughout your community and mailing the cards to your family and friends to educate them on how to identify and stop the spread of misinformation, as well as how to register to vote. I will put registration information on how to sign up for the cards in the chat. And now I would like to welcome our 2 speakers. They are true experts on the topic of voting access and advocacy, and we are so grateful they've shared their time and talents with us this evening. Denise Lieberman is a nationally recognized voter rights lawyer who has been on the front line of voting rights decisions in Missouri and our nation for 20 years. She serves as director and general counsel for the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition, a nonpartisan statewide network of voter advocates that includes civil rights, labor, faith, and civic engagement groups who collaborate to advance voting rights strategy in our state. She has testified in support of the Voting Rights Advancement Act. As the former national director of Power and Democracy for the Advancement Project National Office, she led voting rights cases with partners in states around the country. At Washington University, Denise is the faculty director of the Voter Access and Engagement Initiative, as well as an adjunct professor of law and political science. In addition, she serves as a consultant for the Brennan Center for Justice. Before joining Advancement Project in 2006, she served as legal director of the ACLU of Eastern Missouri. And speaking of the ACLU, Mo Del Villar, our other speaker joining us this evening, is the legislative associate for the American Civil Liberties Union of Missouri. She is responsible for working with elected officials and community organizations on issues related to the rights of Missourians. As a former intern with the ACLU's Washington, D.C. Legislative Office, she worked with the criminal justice team to provide research and analysis on proposals focusing on sentencing, reentry, clemency, and women's prison issues. This work was used to create a roadmap for criminal justice reform, which provided concrete proposals addressing reform issues affecting diverse communities. She served 2 U.S. senators and a U.S. congresswoman in Washington. Her portfolio included judiciary nominations, technology, science, and environmental protections, as well as national security issues. Denise will begin our presentation, followed by Mo, and after they are finished, we will have a Q&A session. Please place your questions in the chat, and we will get to them after they're both finished speaking. Denise, please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Thank you so much, Ruth, and to the Women's Voices Race for Social Justice and all the other sponsors of tonight's program. It's so wonderful to see so many people here tonight interested in talking about our freedom to vote. And I'm really excited to be here. Those of you who know me know that I'm a slides person, so I'm going to share my screen. So hopefully you can follow along. So we're here to talk tonight about voter sabotage and election sabotage in particular. And I'll be interested to hear if folks sort of really even knew what that was before we came together tonight. As Michelle mentioned, I am the director of the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition, which is a nonpartisan statewide network of voter advocates that work to protect our freedom to vote. In particular, for voters of color, low-wage workers, young voters, seniors, voters with disabilities, English plus communities, and sexual minorities who face the greatest barriers to the ballot and are often the intended targets of voter suppression efforts. And we do this through 4 buckets of work, including policy advocacy, which is going to be a lot of what I'm going to talk about tonight. We help lead legislative advocacy in Missouri with respect to access to the ballot, and also track federal and run campaigns on federal legislation that affects access to the ballot for Missouri's voters. But we also do this through strategic litigation and legal advocacy. Filed several lawsuits last year, for example, to ensure that all Missourians could safely vote amid the pandemic. And we did so in collaboration with the ACLU of Missouri. We do this through voter education and engagement, palm cards, toolkits, trainings, etc. And finally, our signature service program is that the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition runs the nonpartisan statewide election protection efforts in the state of Missouri. That includes a toll-free hotline that's answered by attorneys here in Missouri, as well as volunteer monitors at polling places across the state to ensure that no voter has to leave the polling place without casting a ballot. And I invite you to join us. You can email us at info@movpc.org or text MOVPC to 66866 if you'd like to get more information about our upcoming events and campaigns. And I invite you to join us. We meet every Monday morning via Zoom at 10 a.m. And I am proud to say that Women's Voices is a very active member of this coalition. And here are some of your leaders at a recent rally we had in front of Senator Blunt's office, urging him to support the Freedom to Vote Act, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. So we're here to talk about election sabotage today. And we have to sort of take a step back and go back to that issue of disinformation that Michelle mentioned in her introduction, because we know it affected everything about how voters cast their ballot, and in particular, it's affecting the fallout from the 2020 elections. You know, the 2020 elections saw the largest voter turnout in history in spite of a deadly pandemic, with record turnout, particularly by voters of color and young voters. And they changed the electoral landscape across the country and in states around the country. So think about places like Georgia. And that, of course, not only was there misinformation going into the election about voting by mail, but of course, the disinformation continued after the election with the big lie promoting widespread confusion and distrust, culminating in, of course, in the January 6th insurrection and attack on our nation's capital. And I suspect when many people think about the notion of election sabotage, that might be the image that comes to your mind. People who are not state actors, right? Non-officials attacking our system of democracy. But unfortunately, it goes much deeper and much more sinister than that. We know that as a result of the big lie, we saw a backlash in 2021 with states around the country introducing and passing new laws to make voting harder for voters, curtailing voting by mail or implementing identification requirements for voters, right? And Missouri was not immune from that, as you're going to hear from Mo. But fortunately, while there were a number of bills introduced this year, we made it through 2021 without any new laws in place. However, that's not going to stay true for very long, as we know many of these measures are getting queued up again for 2022. And some of the earliest hearings that have already occurred during the recess featured, for example, a 4-hour-long hearing about Mike Lindell's cybersecurity conference. And for some of us, it may feel borderline ridiculous, right? We sometimes sort of discount some of these notions. But we know that the rhetoric we've seen here in Missouri, the attacks we're seeing here in Missouri are part of a larger nationwide battle. In fact, we are seeing right now the greatest assault on our freedom to vote in this country since at least the Jim Crow era. I actually believe it is the greatest assault on our freedom to vote since the post-Reconstruction era, where states across the country, particularly in the South, embarked on a full-fledged assault to largely dismantle the new voting bloc of newly freed African-American voters, right? And so, as Representative Sewell said, old battles have become new again. And so across the country this year, we saw a record number of restrictive voting bills in states around the country, about 425 restrictive voting bills introduced in 49 out of the 50 states, including right here in Missouri, with 33 new laws in place in 19 states just in 2021 alone. Remember, this is an off year when things are supposed to be quiet. And these new laws are things that many of you are familiar with, because I know that you're joining this call because you've been following and you care about issues about access to the ballot. And many of these new laws target the very practices that voters came to rely upon in the pandemic in particular to cast their ballots. So a bunch of spate of new laws attacking voting by mail, changing or limiting the deadlines, making it more difficult to get an application or a ballot, criminalizing assisting voters in getting mail-in ballots, limiting drop boxes or the ability to return ballots, or implementing stricter identification requirements either for mail-in ballots or for in-person voting. And so you can see just a few examples of some of these new laws that are on the books. And I think when many of us think about measures that lawmakers can take, we think about these laws that are targeting the voters and how they access the ballot. And we might not be thinking about things like cyber ninjas, which, yes, I appreciate that, Stephanie. It sort of evokes that feeling of ridiculousness, kind of like that Missouri hearing we had a couple months ago. But the truth of the matter is that while these headlines may seem sort of fringe, they are actually coming from lawmakers themselves who are passing laws to enshrine this type of activity into law. So we saw it in Arizona with the fake audit with the cyber ninjas, right? Which of course confirmed what election officials in their duly elected and appointed positions confirmed, was that the elections were free and fair. In fact, every election security expert in this country has reaffirmed again and again that the 2020 elections were the most fair in our history. But it goes beyond even those audits and the cyber ninjas, right? Because we're seeing actually direct attacks on election officials and their ability to administer elections at the local level, causing many to leave, to resign, and in fact, sometimes being forced out by partisan lawmakers who are passing new laws to do that. Indeed, some are even facing threats. This is Brad Raffensperger. He's the Republican Secretary of State of Georgia. An avowed Trump supporter, as a self-avowed Trump supporter. But as you all know, because you've watched the news, he refused to bow to Trump's request to rig the election results. Audit after audit after audit after audit in Georgia confirmed that the results were in fact valid and secure. Nevertheless, Brad Raffensperger has received death threats. What you're seeing on the right side of that slide are actual text messages his wife received, causing the Raffenspergers to have to go into hiding. He's not the only elections official that had to go into hiding in 2021. Arizona Secretary of State Katie Hobbs also received death threats, had to go into hiding. Michigan Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson had armed protesters in front of her home. And so I want to sort of take us where this is all going. And I found a quote by Rick Hasen. He's a professor at University of California at Irvine who runs the election law blog and is an election law expert, who said the Trump presidency, in essence, the big lie about the security of America's elections, moved the voting wars from a tired debate over the relative threats of voter fraud compared to voter suppression to a new level of the delegitimization of the election process itself, raising the danger of election subversion. So that's how I want us to define this notion of election subversion: a delegitimization of the election process itself. Now, we've seen this in the news. We've seen it through the big lie. We've seen it through the spate of disinformation out there. But now we are also seeing it in law. There were over 180 bills that contained election sabotage provisions in 2021 alone. In short, these measures give partisan officials more power to control local election administration, either by allowing them to simply remove elections officials or limiting the autonomy of local election officials to administer elections. Secondly, the themes of these laws and bills tend to give partisan poll watchers greater abilities to intimidate or harass voters or criminalize election workers that try to stop that from happening. So you're seeing that in the bill that were passed in Arizona and Texas. In some cases, even enabling state legislatures to overturn elections results. In some cases, without a requirement of an actual basis to do so. The bill in Missouri, for example, would have given Missouri lawmakers the ability to directly overturn election results. And finally, the other theme that we've seen is where the cyber ninjas come in, enabling partisan audits without setting up standards for a basis for those audits, some of which are targeting only certain counties based on partisan preference and without adequate safeguards. In short, and that I'm trying to define this here because I think it's just something we're not talking about so much. It's sort of this new kind of lane of voter suppression. We're so used to talking about photo ID and voting by mail and absentee voting. And now this lane is front and center. In short, election sabotage legislation attempts to change who runs elections, making them run by partisan actors, who counts the votes, and how the votes are counted and certified. So here's what we saw. With respect to partisan control, there were bills in 16 states to give partisan lawmakers greater control over local elections. And 2 states passed laws giving state legislatures power to remove election officials and replace them with partisan operatives of their choosing. The most notable being in Georgia. Georgia's new law, Senate Bill 202, removes the Secretary of State, that's Brad Raffensperger, as the chair of the state elections board. Just think about that. Replacing it by a chair selected by partisan lawmakers. So now it's a partisan position, not a position that is dictated by elections expertise. 3 states removed the ability of election officials to regulate partisan poll monitors. With respect to these sham audits, election reviews, 7 states had bills to do that, and 5 actually attempted to launch phony reviews of the 2020 election results. By the way, spoiler alert, none of them found anything different from the results that were certified by elections officials. Criminalization, 16 states had bills threatening election officials with prosecution for even inadvertent errors or noncompliance with elections rules, which is not uncommon to happen. These things can often be corrected or addressed. Any of you who have worked even peripherally in the elections process know what a stressful and just hectic space that is. Some of these bills also would create new causes of action to sue election officials, sanction them with financial and money sanctions, or even criminal sanctions. And 6 states passed laws that would threaten election officials with sanctions or heightened criminal penalties. So it's no wonder now that you're seeing a flood of resignations of highly experienced elections officials, particularly in locations where they're being targeted. For example, Fulton County, Georgia, which is where Atlanta is, and other urban centers. These bills are targeting urban election officials who tend to oversee jurisdictions that tend to skew more progressive. And finally, that power to overturn elections. 7 states, including Missouri, introduced bills to give elected officials power to overturn the elections. Missouri's bill, which did not move forward, would have allowed lawmakers the ability to overturn election results. Right, and these really threaten the overall administration of elections and are causing the exodus of experienced elections officials and are eroding confidence in our elections. And ironically, it's that very erosion of confidence in elections that these very same lawmakers then use to justify further restrictions on voters themselves. For example, photo ID laws. We need photo ID laws because voters lack confidence in elections. We need to limit who can access voting by mail because voters lack confidence in the elections, while they are actually creating the erosion of public confidence in elections. So what's the solution? Well, there's actually federal legislation that would block many of these tactics. It's called the Freedom to Vote Act. The Freedom to Vote Act, those of you who have been participating in our calls, as you know, is a wide sweeping piece of legislation. And it would go a long way to set minimum standards for voters to access the ballot by allowing same-day voter registration.
And you get that?
By prohibiting strict photo ID requirements, by guaranteeing early voting. But what it would also do is protect local election officials from undue interference and address election subversion. So the Freedom to Vote Act does all of these things, right? It has major provisions relating to expanding minimum standards for voter access to ensure that voters can cast the ballot, blocking voter suppression, prohibiting long lines more than 30 minutes, restoring voting rights upon release from prison, prohibiting strict photo ID requirements, modernizing voter registration, ensure fair redistricting processes by mandating nonpartisan redistricting commissions, put more transparency in dark money contributions, But this legislation also includes provisions on election sabotage. And here's what they are. In essence, they would prohibit local election officials from politically motivated reprisals like we have seen in some of these key states like Georgia and Arizona, banning state officials from removing local election officials for minor mistakes, except for sort of major malfeasance, making it illegal to publicly target election workers and their families through doxing, mandating distance between election observers and voters to protect voters from intimidation, making it illegal to interfere with the tabulation, certification, and counting of ballots, limiting voter purges, allowing voters to correct ballot defects, so minor clerical errors or even minor clerical errors on the part of elections workers don't result in disqualification, and finally, giving private citizens the right to sue if elected officials attempt to nullify valid election results. So it would prohibit statewide officials from suspending, removing local election officials, except for gross negligence. It would prohibit intimidation, threats, or coercion of election officials that are now being allowed to happen as a result of some of these laws. It would extend protection for the preservation of election records to ensure that valid risk limiting audits can occur after elections. Those are the valid audits. Those are the ones that are done according to science. And it would prohibit poll watchers from coming within 8 feet of a voter or 8 feet of a ballot during the processing, scanning, tabulation, canvassing, or certification of those ballots. And it would mandate those risk limiting audits, which is really considered the gold standard in being able to certify and audit election results. And the truth of the matter is, voters overwhelmingly of all political parties want this kind of reform. A recent poll from September found that the vast majority, we're talking here over 80% in many cases, would support laws to ensure that officials cannot unduly influence election procedures. And voters are also concerned, these polls found, about the increase in threats to election officials. And so nearly 80% of voters support allowing election officials to be protected from intimidation, right? And overall, these numbers hold true with the Freedom to Vote Act's provisions writ large. 72% of voters, including a majority of Democrats, Republicans, and independents, support those provisions in the Freedom to Vote Act overall. And here in Missouri, it would be a game changer. While many of the provisions included in the Freedom to Vote Act are operating well in other states, like online voter registration and automatic voter registration and early voting and voting by mail, many of them don't exist in Missouri. And so passage of this legislation would really change accessibility of elections for Missouri voters, and would go a long way to preventing the kind of bills that we saw in the Missouri legislature last year. Now, this legislation has passed out of the House of Representatives and has come for an initial vote in the United States Senate. And you know what happened? It was filibustered. That initial vote, called a cloture vote, is simply a vote to allow debate on this legislation. And I don't know about you, but if you looked at any of the headlines, and I only just offered a select few, and many of them were headlines from even just the last week, it's quite clear that people are concerned about these issues. Yet Senate Republicans filibustered and prevented even debate on this legislation, even a conversation about it. Which begs the question, what are they so afraid of? Why are they so scared of having even a conversation about these issues, right? And so they're in recess this week. They're going to return. They've got other priorities on their plate, but Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer has promised that this will be a priority before they recess this fall. So call your senators. This is a coalition number 888-453-3211. If you want some tips on what to say, here are some, but in essence, simply tell them that we need voting reform. At bare minimum, these bills deserve to be debated and come to a vote. If you join our meetings in the future, you'll get some great messaging tips. There's a lot of powerful polling and information about these bills and how people are thinking about them around the country. So I urge you to join us. We do more than just talk about polling. We also get out and we rally in favor of these bills. Here are some of our rallies over the summer. That's for the Black Voters Matter Freedom Rides. We've even had Mayor Tashara Jones issue a proclamation naming May 8th John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Day in the city of St. Louis. And so I hope that you will come and join your fellow members of Women's Voices and the other sponsoring organizations in this effort. So join us on Mondays. Email us at info@movpc.org. And I am excited and encouraged that so many of you are part of this call tonight to help us make the promise of the freedom to vote a reality for all voters in Missouri.
Thank you so much, Denise. We have a few questions we will ask you with after the entire presentation. Mo, please share with us everything local, Missouri.
Hello.
What do you do?
Oh, yes. Hello. Hello. Thank you, Denise, for the toss about what is going on in our lovely state house. I want to thank obviously Ruth and the Women's Voices Raised for Social Justice and all the sponsors of this event as well. You know, we're focusing here tonight on the ability of everyday Missourians to exercise their right to vote. And I don't think it comes as a surprise to any of you joining us tonight that voting and election bills is a battleground here in Missouri. We are very often, as Denise has laid out, on the front lines of some of these terrible, awful voting ideas. And we like to take some of the bad ideas from our neighbors as well and fold those in. Thankfully, as Denise has already mentioned, no new bills were passed in this last session. But given some of the hearings that were already mentioned that occurred over the summer, we know that they're going to be coming in fast and furious this election with these election legislations and even more. So I'm just going to start with a very brief overview on some of the buckets of bad, as I call them, the things that they have tended to focus on in the last sessions. And again, none of these were passed, but it's not that they weren't able to be passed. Everything was set up for passage in the last week of the legislative session, and Senate decided to combust and take their ball and go home. So many of these pieces of legislation are actively ready to go on day one on pre-filing that starts on December 1st. So it's important to pay attention to what it is that they've done in the past that they have ready to go. And then I'll touch a little bit on what they discussed over the summer, like Denise was talking about, that can prepare us for some of the new things that they may be introducing as well. So the first bucket is going to be the photo ID issue and concern. There were a number of bills that they introduced that included in part or in whole some photo ID restrictions, including HB 334, 738, and SB 282. And what the bulk of these bills tried to do was remove non-photo ID options for voters. And as Denise eloquently testified in many hearings, that just does not work for nearly 200,000 Missourians in the state to have to rely on the state issued government issued IDs as the only form to be able to vote. It is unfair. It disproportionately affects minorities, communities that are transient, folks who may not have the means or transportation to get to where they need for a DMV. And so by removing some of those non-photo ID options, they would require voters to cast a provisional ballot. And we have concerns with the provisional ballots and the ways in which they would or would not be counted if that person were to return with a photo ID. So there were a number of unconstitutionally strict voter ID bills that have been struck down a number of times by our own Supreme Court. So it is really quite a wonder that they keep introducing these bills, knowing that, as they call them, the black robe tyrants from across the street are going to smack their hand down on these bills again. So in narrowing, trying to impose some of these unconstitutional strict voter ID laws, they're again just trying to impact communities that are most vulnerable, communities of color, elderly, the transient. Some of these bills also bucketed with the next bucket of bad, which I call absentee voting changes. As many of you have lived through this plague and pandemic, there were a number of changes made in the 2020 session, in the 2020 year and special session, that would allow people to vote safely. More safe during the November 2020 general election. Also within that, they were trying to limit early voting that is available to voters. We have not the greatest early voting in the state of Missouri. I moved back home to Missouri after living in Maryland, and I was stunned that I still could not, even after being gone and returning, couldn't vote on a Saturday if I felt like it, couldn't vote on my walk home from the metro if I felt like it, after work, after the farmer's market on a Thursday. And I firsthand saw how important it was having that access for people. If you have your kids, if you only have time after you're picking up a prescription, these things are important, and access to the ballot and making it as easy as possible is really, I think, what we're all gathered here to try to ensure happens. So that is one of the absentee voting changes that they had anticipated trying to get passed. And again, there is just conflicting language that they would include about whether ballots could be mailed, dropped off. And these minute details are things that people like Denise and myself often, unfortunately, have to watch in extreme detail for every word, every comma, every hyphen, to ensure that they're not trying to sneak in some of these restrictions. And the last bucket of bad that I'll touch on, again, your state does a number of terrible things, and I welcome you to listen in on a hearing on any issue or topic that may be of interest to you. I know we're focusing on elections and voting right now, but my goodness, the number of things that they can cover in a session are innumerable. So, but the next bucket of bad that they've done work on is the initiative petition process, and they've really been going at this for a very long time. And same with the voter ID. I know Denise has been fighting that since 2015 or 2005, I believe. You know, these are not new battles in the state, but it seems like they're starting to sharpen some of the points that they've been trying to make throughout the years, and may have an opportunity to get some of these things across the line in the coming years. So the initiative petition process is a valuable and very important process to the people of Missouri. It allows the people to stand up and say directly what they do and do not want in their constitution, and what they do and do not want as a statute. It allows them to bypass the General Assembly for a number of concerns and put things straight on the ballot for other voters to vote on and get their thoughts and opinions on. So what they have tried to do is limit and restrict our access to that in a number of different ways, trying to increase the number of congressional districts that you would need to get vote signatures from. Instead of 2/3 being 6 of the state's 8 congressional districts, you would have to get them from all 8. If you, they would increase the percentage of how many people would need to get how many signatures would need to be gathered in those congressional districts. So you would have to increase the number of congressional districts that you would need to get signatures from, and you would also need to increase the percentage. By some estimations for a congressional amendment, that could be almost an additional almost 500,000 signatures. I think 400,000 was about the estimate of some of those initiative petition ballots. And again, in the midst of a plague that we're still going through, and with a number of other restrictions that they're trying to put in place, this is just egregious in trying to put another barrier between the people and their ability to legislate for themselves and govern themselves. So that's just a number of issues that they have tried to put in place. And also the Secretary of State, our dear friend, Jay Ashcroft, has come to testify on behalf of a number of these bills, including some of the Mike Lindell thing that we'll get into in just a moment. But some of the things that they have tried to introduce in the initiative petition process has been really, I would say, kind of swarmy, kind of misleading. The inability to have judicial checks that they say is overreach when, having that balance of power between the executive branch and the judicial branch is just vitally important. Again, particularly in the state of Missouri, where we have a track record of trying to kind of sneak in some of these restrictions. In one of the voter ID bills, there would be no requirement for the Secretary of State to give notice to the people that these changes would have been made. This is just not great. So it is incumbent that the judicial branch is able to watch over what is going on in the executive branch, but also for the people to be able to see what's going on and to speak on issues in front of the Secretary of State and issues in front of the elections committees and the General Assembly at large. I'm going to transition into what I think they may be adding into this year. Off the bat, does not need to be stated, but apparently it does anyways. There is no evidence of widespread voter fraud or irregularities during the 2020 election. The Secretary of State of Missouri has said that a number of times. Many of our county clerks have said that a number of times. I have not heard of reports of such intense pushback on some of that language here in Missouri as has happened with Brad Rafflesberger. No. Katzenberger. I might have been right the first time. My apologies. The gentleman from the Secretary of State from Georgia that was having such a tough time with the people down there. But there is no evidence, and the Elections Committee will tell you there is no evidence of widespread voter fraud and irregularities. However, in the spirit of what the chair of the committee says in trying to get fair, transparent, trustworthy elections, they allowed for a number of hearings over the summer, including a reporting back from one of the representatives on Mike Lindell's cyber symposium for election security. I'm not going to rehash some of the crazier things that were testified upon that day, but even among some of the crazier things that were said, that we were hacked by China, or that, some internet something, this, that, and then the other. These are concerns that are being brought to the committee by members of the committee. And so, we really have to focus and focus in on some of these people that are serving on the election committees. We are grateful that we had representatives like Kevin Windham and Joe Adams that were able to push back on some of the crazier issues. But like Denise mentioned earlier, a lot of the conspiracy theories that were given out that day tried to undermine our experienced elections officials who are in election day, is their Super Bowl, and they prepare for this for months in advance. They've done this for years. This is not their first rodeo. And so we are also blessed to have former county clerk on the elections committee, who in fact in that hearing pushed back on some of the crazier conspiracy theories. So I bring that up and mention that to say there are people on all sides of this who are seeing it for what it is and are trying to move forward, at least in the election security portion, in a way that really does protect all Missourians and does allow for some safer, less election sabotage, so we could be a little less like Georgia. But like Denise mentioned, a lot of these hearings, a lot of this outrage is manufactured. It is created by the bills that they're bringing up, by the clips that they are saying, by the things that they are putting forth as important. But there are a lot of people that are still trying to do good. And so I'm not gonna browbeat on how defensive we have to be in the state without at least trying to highlight some of the good that is still being done and why it is so important to reach out to those people that are doing good, to let them know in this environment that is not so forgiving and not so welcoming, we see you trying to do good. Like Denise mentioned, the vast majority of people, as high 80, high 70s, have concerns for election officials and doing their official work during election day. They support the Freedom to Vote Act, and many of the pieces of legislation within there that would expand voting access to people, early voting, and issue petition protections, making election day a national holiday. There are good things happening, and within the State House that remains true as well. There are bills that have been introduced to ensure translators for people that require ballots in another language. I don't know if you know this, but if you currently, for example, my mother speaks Spanish, she speaks English also, but if she didn't and she only spoke Spanish and I went up there to help her, I could only help my mother. And if I was an official translator, I could only go and help one person at a time. So if there are 70 people who need 70 different languages or 70 different translations with the same language, you still need 70 translators for that transaction to occur, and that's madness. So again, trying to ensure access to people who have been most affected by a lot of these restrictions in the past, or a lot of this inability to have access, lack of inclusivity. For example, ensuring access to visually impaired voters at every ballot, at every voting place. And of course, a big one that has been going on for a number of years, and that overlaps with a lot of the work that I've done in the past, is getting people who are on probation and parole access to the ballot. Once you have served your time and you have gone past your incarceration, there is no reason why, if you can get a driver's license, you should be able to get a vote at that point, or if that's the requirement that we need for so many people, and you've served your time in that way. We want to ensure that you have a right to say something in what's going on around you, and so that is a one way that a huge disproportionate number of people are affected by disenfranchisement in this state. And I think the last point that I want to round out and end on is my silver lining since, quite frankly, the day Trump got elected, was so many more people text me and asked me what was going on. So many more people were involved. People in all areas of my life, college friends, my aunts, my neighbors, people I just meet randomly. More people are involved in this process, and that is always a good thing. That is always a good thing, and that is why they try so hard to restrict it, because so many more people fall on the side of granting access, having free and fair elections, having a fair criminal justice system, giving the ability of people to have good jobs, safe neighborhoods, get their kids a good education. So many more people fall on that side of the moral good, that for so many more of us to be involved, that really makes a change and really makes a shift. It wasn't that long ago that we were a blue state, or a purple state split in half. It wasn't that long ago that we had Democratic governors and vice versa. At least conservatives or representatives that you could speak to and have decent conversations to move things forward. That is still happening in the State House, and obviously we have to work with the people that we're able to work with in the building despite it being so defensive, we do still get some good things done in there. So that's why it's important. Like I said, reach out to the people who whose bills you support. Give them a good idea if you want, and pay attention to what the people that are representing you are doing in the State House, because they are doing it in your name. And if you don't like what they're doing, you have the right to tell them so. And I really sincerely hope that you do, because that really does move the needle, as someone who has heard it in the federal Congress and in our State House. You call, they listen, because they listen to their constituents more than they listen to lobbyists or the experts in the matter. They really care about what you think. And so I will end that with, I appreciate you giving us your time on a Thursday, Veterans Day. I know some of you may have been off today. So thank you for being involved in this process this far, and happy to answer questions and move on to next steps with Denise.
Thank you both so much. We all know that your vote is your voice, and your voice is your power, and we can't let others speak for ourselves, speak for us. We have to make sure everybody gets out and engages in the process. So before we get to some of the more specific questions, I have a question for both of you is, how can we energize the electorate and ensure eligible voters participate in the process?
I mean, by doing things like this, right? I mean, I think Mo had a really great comment when you talked about how the last election cycle really galvanized so many people around you. And I have noticed that as well. You know, I mean, on our weekly Missouri Voter Protection Coalition calls, we get like 70, 80, 90, sometimes 100 people on the calls. It's really incredible, because people realize that this is such an important issue. But more importantly, I think that the key, and what all the trainings that I've been to seem to suggest, is personalizing it and localizing it, telling your own story. The truth of the matter is, I gave you a lot of data tonight. I gave you a lot of like statistics about the numbers of bills and numbers of states. And I didn't really get to tell you stories about actual voters, but each one of us has a story. There's a reason each of you showed up here tonight. Each of you has a voting story. And when we start telling our stories and sharing our stories, what I have found in my work is that it resonates. I often tell the story of my own mother, who now no longer drives and now gets a ballot at home, but who would not be able to get a state issued photo ID because the name on her birth certificate doesn't match the name on her current forms of identification. And all of us have a reason that we care about this. And when we can start even practicing articulating those stories, and thankfully you've got some nice holiday cards from Women's Voices that can maybe help you kick off that what might otherwise have been an uncomfortable Thanksgiving table conversation. But when you start telling it in the realm of being your personal story, it's much harder to debate that, right? It's much harder to refute that.
Excellent. That was part of exactly what I was going to say. In the 2016 election, so many people reached out to me, and it felt like a reaction to Trump. They didn't know what was going on. They didn't understand the process. Something was off, right? But now that we've mustered through that together and made it to where we are now, so many of those people are focusing on the things that matter to them. You know, we can, especially living through the times that we've just lived through, the unprecedented 5 years that we continue to live in unprecedented times, people see and recognize and have been touched personally with what government can and cannot do, can and will not do for them. You know, getting them checks in their pockets, giving them access to education if possible, freeing up financial concerns with, you know, limiting student loans. Getting people involved has not always been the easiest. I've been doing organizing and politics for so many years in my life, and it can be very difficult, but if we can connect those value of good and what a good government can do for people, I think that they can really understand that. And Denise's point on making it personal is right on. Some people don't understand or have never seen a different way of how the world can be. And I am the daughter of immigrants who came from countries under dictatorships. And my parents came to this country and they said, we can watch your government. You better cut on C-SPAN. We are watching this hearing on transportation. And that's where my really weird love of boring government bureaucracy comes from. But it was important to them because they didn't have that. They didn't have the opportunity to even do that freely and as openly as they wanted to. So, it's that personal aspect of how important it is to you, how important it is to your family and your communities that I think really galvanize people and show them that you care. And if I care, we can both care together and we can move forward to where we need to go.
That was a beautiful story, Mo. I don't know that we all ever really appreciate the gifts our democracy gives us until we see people that didn't always appreciate them. So thank you for that. We have a few questions that are very in the weeds, but the first one is for Denise. How is it constitutional for state legislatures to overturn results of an election?
I don't think it is. But, that doesn't stop them from passing bad laws, right? I mean, or even attempting to do so. There were, over 60 lawsuits attempting to challenge the election results last November. None of them prevailed, but it sure gummed everything up for quite a long time. And more importantly, even though not a single one of them prevailed, it perpetuated and continued to perpetuate and legitimize the big lie in a way that then created the foundation and the fuel for this spate of new voting legislation that is harming voters across the country. And so with all these new laws we've seen in states around the country, those are now in the middle of litigation. In the last few months, there's been a spate of new litigation, but we know we can't rely on the courts either. I mean, the United States Supreme Court is a court that has been hostile to voting rights. Just 3 months ago in July, they significantly weakened the Voting Rights Act in a case called Brennan versus DNC. And 8 years ago, weakened it in a case called Shelby versus Holder. So, we can't stay silent, right? When they're passing laws that are unconstitutional. I mean, we go to Jefferson City every year and tell them that photo ID law is unconstitutional every single year. I was so blunt this year. I was like, we're going to sue you. It's going to be struck down. And they were like, okay, right? So, and the problem is that ends up burdening voters and voter advocates quite extensively and takes us away from being able to devote our resources to affirmative pieces. So uplifting this in our organizations, in the press, writing letters to the editor, and making, what we know is that lawmakers respond to their constituents, like Mo said. Let them know how you feel, even if you think that they aren't going to agree with you. They keep track of all those calls. Let them know that you're watching them and that you don't stand for it.
In that same vein, it seems there's an increasing fringe aspect of legislators in the bills they're creating. What more can be done to emphasize how strange these are and how different from the average person and how dangerous these ideas can be?
That is a poignant question, and yes, this isn't the first time that we have gone through this isn't the first time in my lifetime. This isn't the first time this millennium. We've had the Tea Party folks, and we've had a number of groups that have come and gone and reconfigured and become other things. And those people at times have, washed away. I don't think anyone in the Congress would call themselves a Tea Party person today. But I think it is the thought that they are putting out. It is the confusion, the misinformation, as Denise said earlier, I think they're creating their own madness. They're creating their own madhouse. And so I think, again, what is most important is that they hear from a diverse group of people across the state, from their, districts, that tell them that this is wrong and this is why. Because as a normal everyday Missourian, I don't think you should be doing that. And if they hear that enough times, they will start to hear it. I am bringing my mind to, unrelated, unfortunately, to this topic, but over the summer, they were trying to defund Planned Parenthood. And all types of medical people wrote into the senators and representatives saying, this is not just about Planned Parenthood. And if you do this, you are going to stop money to come in from all kinds of people, funeral service people, medical, nursing homes. And one senator took point to notice, do you see all the groups of people here that are not repro people, that are not the people that you want to yell at with this bill and with the actions that you're doing? And that mattered at the end of the day, that it was a broad supportive group of people that were stepping up and saying, this is not right. And it may not be my group that you're yelling at, but it's definitely my group that you're affecting also. And I don't like that. And so if we can stand up for that in voting, which does affect every single one of us, and we should be fighting for each other's right as much as our own to have that free access to the ballot. But it is so different, a lot of what they're saying, from the average person. So they need to hear from average people, and they need to hear from you often as possible.
Thank you. The next question, I'm sure you anticipated, Denise. It's about the filibuster. And it is, what is the chance a temporary suspension of the filibuster could be accomplished to try to get the Freedom to Vote Act passed? And a tangent to that is there any prayer that either Missouri senators will support the Freedom to Vote Act, or even suspension of the filibuster to debate and vote on this act?
That's a great question. And yeah, they actually do have the power. They don't even need to suspend the filibuster. They just need to reform it. Right? I mean, what they were able to do in that cloture vote was just simply basically raise their hand and create a unilateral veto. They're not even required to stand up, not even like with the Wendy Davis tennis shoes, stand up and speak filibuster, right? If they had to do that, that would actually change the whole dynamic. And you know how they can reform the rules of the filibuster? Majority vote. There's 50 Democrats in the United States Senate say they support the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. Those 50 senators plus Kamala Harris's tie-breaking vote could absolutely, that's all that's needed to reform those rules. They don't even need to abolish it. They need to change the rules. And there's a lot of data on how often this has been done. It actually has been done a ton of times. Like hundreds of times they change the rules about how the filibuster works. The filibuster is not a constitutionally protected structure. The right to vote is. Right? It's just a procedural posture. So yes, they can absolutely do it, and they have the numbers to do it. Will Blunt and Hawley support the legislation in the long run? I don't know. But Senator Blunt is leaving office. He's preparing to retire after decades of public service. He must be thinking about what his legacy is. He supported the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act the last time it was reauthorized. In the past, this wasn't a partisan issue. It's this whole sort of cacophony of the big lie that has turned it into one. I don't know that we necessarily need them to vote for it, though, but at bare minimum, it deserves to have a conversation.
I will I just wanted to put a plug in here for, in Missouri, we do have those standing filibusters, and we have some phenomenal filibusters, if I'm being honest with you. I do love me a good filibuster when it's done right. And a number of recipes and other stories will come up. So literally any Tuesday and many Mondays during session, if you want to pop in and listen to the Senate, senate.mo.gov, they will probably be filibustering something, and you will learn something in the process. I just wanted to put a plug for that piece of the filibuster at the State House.
It's our own personal C-SPAN to watch Missouri in action. Would either speaker want to comment on the current redistricting processes and the impact of that on healthy democracy?
I think I'll just hop in and very briefly, because wow, redistricting could be its own thing. And I know many of us have gone to, or at least heard and tried to listen and give testimony to in some of those redistricting hearings. I think the main point for redistricting has been the point that has been brought up this whole time. Everyone counts. Everyone counts. Everyone's vote counts. Everyone counts. And so for the redistricting portion and our rights to be reapportioned correctly as citizens, this is again something where we have to pay attention. And I say this in a way that is not necessarily every individual's responsibility, because there's a gentleman that came into one of the redistricting hearings talking about congressional districts. And they said, no, this is for state house and state senate. And then everyone giggles. But it's really, truly not that man's fault that the government has not given him the information to know, well, who's responsible for this? Who do I call if this is my issue and my concern? I want to know what's going on. What maps are you going to draw? Who does that? What is the timeline on that? And so for redistricting, that's another one where it is very nuanced and it can be very lost in what is going on and what's not going on. And another piece of it that is so important to our democracy, you can't vote your way out of being gerrymandered into, that is the point of it. And so there are parts of that protection that we need to have within the drawing of those maps and within the duty and responsibility of the people who are drawing that maps, be it the commissions that have been given that responsibility now, the judges that may end up drawing it at the end of the day, and the General Assembly who is responsible for drawing our congressional maps.
I agree with all that, but the one thing I want to add to it is that while this is a nuanced and cumbersome process, as Mel just said, your participation in it doesn't have to be. Actually, and I encourage folks to participate either by testifying or submitting testimony at the state legislative district, state senate, state representative, and even in your local. I'm here in St. Louis, and there's community groups that are coming together to organize around redistricting in the city of St. Louis, where they're trying to reduce the number of wards from 28 to 14. And what those folks need to hear isn't like stuff about the law or data or statistics. They actually want to hear what your neighborhood means to you. What constitutes your community? And there's actually data that supports that the more people sort of tell the stories about people in my community, we all center around like this one hospital and over here with this school district, and all of us who are part of that school district are all part of this community. And it kind of ends at where the park is. There's actually data that supports that when people are specific like that, just talking about what their neighborhood looks like, those things actually get incorporated into final maps. People that come up and say, don't split my school district in two. Or, there's a shared communities of interest between these two kind of municipalities, and we always kind of are in it together. That can help ensure that people who are aligned with one another are able to be in the same districts and elect candidates of choice.
You are both so knowledgeable. I think we could all spend all night listening to you, but to be respectful of all of our time, I have two more questions and then we'll wrap it up. The first is there anything like an election worker convention or a union for election workers?
There's a state association of election officials. There's a Missouri Association, Missouri Clerks Association. And so they actually do have a convention. They do meet, and they actually come up with policy positions.
And the final question is, what is the best language to combat the phrases election integrity, free and fair, count every legal vote, protect the vote, things like that sound like what all Americans would want, but really allude to an underbelly of fraud in need of reform? That's
Denise. Denise is on messaging. That's all you.
Yeah, sure. And I encourage you to join our weekly Missouri Voter Protection Coalition calls to get into this in greater in the weeds. But the short answer is lead with values. Freedom to vote is what polls the strongest. Talking about the freedom to vote and what we want to see in our communities. And this will also make sure that we end on a positive note, Michelle. when we talk about what we aspire to be, the freedom to vote, that all people deserve to have a say in their communities, keeping it out of the weeds. We don't want to talk about process and procedure. We don't want to talk about the filibuster. We want to talk about why is voting important. I think each one of you tonight could probably answer the question, why are you here tonight? Why is voting important to you? Because it gives you the ability to have a say in things that you care about. Gives you the ability to have a say in things that matter to you, your families, your children, and your future. That is the most powerful messaging that every polling and all the polling data suggest, the freedom to vote, because we all deserve to have a say in the matters that affect us.
We all have the power within us. That's the most powerful thing you could teach us all. I want to thank you all for joining us. I want to thank our co-sponsors, the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition, the National Council of Jewish Women, the Jewish JCRC, which is the Jewish Community Relations Council, Indivisible Missouri, and the League of Women Voters. We appreciate all of your time. We appreciate all of your expertise. If this has gotten you guys all fired up, we have the tools to make sure you have a peaceful Thanksgiving holiday, and that is to share the misinformation and disinformation cards and door hangers. Our country has really been torn apart by misinformation, disinformation, and sometimes it leaves us as if we have nothing in common. But we really can protect our community by sharing the 7 simple rules in our cards. They're right here. And we can all, thank you, Ruth, we can all help secure our shared future by sharing this information and teaching people how we have so much more in common than we think we do. And you can register on our website for the packets. Again, I thank you so much to Denise and Mo. You truly are, your talents are so appreciated by our community and the state at large. And thank you all for your time.